Good evening and welcome. My name is Vijay Mehta, Chair of Uniting for Peace, and I'm pleased to see you all dedicated peace and development activities, NGOs, youth and students. All of you are the driving force, and it's your passion which is behind all the social change in our world. It's an honor to have the Right Honourable Ben MP, former Secretary of State for International Development, with us today as our keynote speaker. Allow me to say a few words about our organization, Uniting for Peace. Among many famous names associated with our organization are Philip Noel Baker, who is the only person who has the distinction in history to won both an Olympic medal and a Nobel Peace Prize. Our present President, Lord Peter Archer, and our Vice President, Lord Frank Judd, have been former cabinet ministers. Uniting for Peace is launching an exciting new campaign, 4D for World Peace. The 4D is a holistic concept approach for uniting the 4 strands of disarmament, demilitarization, development and democracy. The core message of the campaign is that threats of today are interlinked, interdependent, and states, individuals and civil society need to work together in tandem to make progress on peace, human rights, development and climate change issues. These issues cannot be tackled by one single country or single organization, no matter how powerful it may be. Just flag out a couple of important or prominent dates for your diary. October the 3rd, a meeting on peace campaigning in today's world. The literature is there, and eminent campaigners around the world will explore strategies and actions to take the 4D for World Peace campaign and also tell us about their campaigns. The second one is in 9th of November. It's a conference around the uprising in Middle East and North Africa. And the title is The Morality of Intervention, Responsibility to Protect, and the Role of United Nations. The topic for today's meeting, after the conflicts, how can development build peace, as an important one, as we have just passed the 10-year mark for the completion of Millennium Development Goals, which are seriously underfunded and will further be exacerbated by the global economic turmoil in Europe and America. In the 21st century, in the midst of plenty, white people have to live on $2 a day and should die of hunger, disease, and denied the right to education and maternal health. Trillions of dollars are being spent on bailing out the banks and on the ongoing war in Afghanistan, while there is a staggering shortfall of funds on the tune of 155 billion. The depressing news is that the G8 countries have made it look they have spent more on fighting poverty than they really have. The other gloomy news is that more than 1.5 billion people live in fragile states under the grip of violence and will not be able to complete any of the single MDGs in time for 2015, especially countries in sub-Saharan Africa. This is one of the important findings of the World Bank Development Report 2011, which examines conflict, security and development and makes the connection between militarism, resource theft and poverty. How do we break the cycle of despair, exclusion, powerlessness and work for an equitable and sustainable world by creating a level field for the developing world? To explore the above issues, we are delighted to have Hilary Benn, who is a Member of Parliament for Leeds Centre. He has served in the cabinet as a Secretary of State for International Development from 2003 to 7 and as Secretary of State for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs from 2007 to 2010. Since October 2010, Ben is the shadow leader of the House of Commons. While at DFID, Hillary played an important role in increasing the UK's aid budget and winning agreement on debt relief for the poorest country in the 2005 Glasgow Summit. He oversaw the UK's response to the Southeast Asian tsunami and the Pakistan earthquake, and that it was his idea that resulted in the establishment of the UN Central Emergency Relief Fund, which now helps the world to respond better to disasters. He also led the UK negotiating team at the UN 2006 Darfur peace negotiations. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Right Honourable Hillary Benn.
Right, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. First of all, can I thank you, and through you, Peter Archer,
yes,
who I know is on the mend,
yes,
for your very kind invitation to join you here today on this special day, UN International Peace Day. And I want to begin by congratulating Uniting for Peace for the work that you do, for the campaign that you're running at the moment. Also to praise Jeremy Gilley, who I see is going to be speaking at another event later on in the autumn, for all the work that he has done in making the Peace One Day movement so successful over the years. This very simple idea, you should have at least one day in the year in which conflict stops. And when I met him a few years ago, he talked with great passion and enthusiasm about how in places this had allowed children to be vaccinated when otherwise it would not have been possible because of continuing conflict. And I think that shows the power of an idea when it's allied to determination to change things. Now, I think what I really wanted to do this evening was to use the opportunity of this gathering together to reflect on the task that we face. And in doing so, just to recount that last month, my wife, my daughter and one of my sons went to Gallipoli in an attempt to discover where my great uncle died in 1915 as part of the First World War. It is a narrow strip of land that is covered in graves and memorials and monuments to the British dead, to the Australian dead, the New Zealand dead, the Turks who lost their lives. And we ended up on the final day standing in the middle of a field of sunflowers. And my son brought out one of the many maps that he had gathered together and said, well, I think trench H12, in which Oliver was last seen, according to one report, dead, another seriously wounded, is roughly over there. And it was quite hard standing there to imagine what it had been like for the young men on both sides of the conflict, fighting to get into that trench and trying to force others out of it. To see that in a bit of countryside of such peace and tranquility. And we eventually got to the Helles Memorial, which is at the very southern end of Gallipoli, and by climbing over a wall, because they're renewing it, found his name, which is one of 22,000 names of those missing who died but whose bodies were never found. And personal journeys like that for many of us are, of course, a reminder of what is at stake in the task that we face. Now, it may seem, for people in London, a long way from where we are to the dry scrublands of Somalia, currently racked by famine, or from the miles and miles and miles of rainforest in the Democratic Republic of the Congo that you see when you fly over a that country that has suffered so much, or the farmers in Afghanistan who are doing their best at the moment to earn a living, but encircled by conflict. But the first thing that we have to acknowledge is that actually none of those places are very far away from us at all. From the dawn of time, humankind has explored the earth that is our shared home. Obviously, history doesn't record the first person who said to themselves, I wonder what is on the other side of the hill. And they climbed the hill, and they came down the other side, and they encountered other human beings. Just like them, they made friends, they traded, they fought, they fell in love, and in short order, I suppose that is the story of human existence. And it is why, and it was the word that you used, Vijay, interdependence is the one word that describes the human condition that we live in the 21st century. And it's why these places are not very far away at all. And what it means for us is that our neighbours are not just the people with whom we share a street or a town. They are our fellow human beings, 6 and a bit billion of us now, with whom we share a very small and a very fragile planet, which we first saw as human beings when those Apollo astronauts took that extraordinary photograph as this green and white and blue Earth appeared above the lifeless landscape of the moon. And we saw for the first time just how small and just how fragile this planet is. Now, whether it's from 250,000 miles away or from much closer, we have a pretty clear idea now of the condition of humankind at the beginning of the 21st century. We know that we live in a world where this morning between 65 and 70 million children weren't where they should be on a Wednesday morning. Where should children be of a morning? They should be in a school with a classroom and a desk and a teacher and the opportunity to open that window on the world that an education gives us. We know that roughly every minute a woman dies in pregnancy or childbirth. We know that every day about 5,000 children lose their lives because of predominantly dirty water and poor sanitation. 1 in 7 children in sub-Saharan Africa never live to celebrate their 5th birthday. My daughter celebrated her 23rd birthday on Saturday. Every year, diseases like malaria and TB and HIV and AIDS claim millions of lives. We live in a world where there are about 1 billion people who are overweight or obese, and another billion who tonight will go to bed hungry because they don't have enough food to eat. And we live in a world where violence and its legacy makes it more difficult to solve these problems. Indeed, in many cases, it has contributed to their creation. And for us, the greatest sense of outrage should really be this. This condition of humankind is not happening at a time of worldwide famine and global conflict, but in an age of plenty that is unprecedented and will certainly be seen as such by our forebears and our ancestors. A world, even with the current economic difficulties that we've got, and they are big, that is about 8 times richer than it was only 50 years ago, not long after I was born. Now, it was William Wilberforce, that great campaigner against slavery, who said, "You may choose to look away, but you can never again say you did not know." And we face a very simple choice as a world. Either we look away or we do something. Either we say it's too difficult or we act. Either we say, I wish the rest of the world would go away and I hope that if I close the shutters and shut the door and pull up the bed covers, somehow this will not affect me and my family and my life. Or we take on the responsibility that we have to build a safer and more secure world. Now, I must confess I am an optimist, because it would be quite easy, faced with the scale of that challenge, to say, it is all too difficult. And I think we should all be optimists. Not that we should be naive, but principally because the alternative to optimism is frankly too awful to contemplate. That's one reason. And the second reason is that the power of human beings coming together to act, the thing that we from time to time give the name politics to, the power of economic development to transform lives, the power of science to save people's lives is immense. And if we do not draw on that, then we will be failing in our responsibility. But at the same time, the challenge that confronts us is immense as well. In trade and technology and migration and climate change and terrorism and disease and the impact that all of them have on our world. So let us just pause for a moment to consider the scale of those challenges. One thing that's happening in the world is that more and more people are moving from the countryside to towns and cities in search of a better life, a process that we in Britain are very familiar with. Question: where will the homes and the water and the sanitation and the education and the healthcare and the jobs that those people need going to come from? How are we going to deal with the violence we see in many cities, in some parts of the world, fueled by drugs? Look at Latin America. How are we going to deal with the violence we see currently off the coast of East Africa, which is the responsibility of the pirates from Somalia? You probably couldn't point to a worse example of a failed state than Somalia. Question: as the world's population increases by half as much again in the next 2 generations, and that's what we're looking at, how are we going to stop many of the as yet unborn from coming into a world of poverty and lack of opportunity? How are we going to feed these additional mouths? Now this is a really big question which has a great bearing on the potential for conflict. The fact that we have as a world, although the food that is available is very unevenly distributed, kept ahead of Malthus's worst predictions, is because of technology and science. The father of the Green Revolution is widely described to be an American by the name of Norman Borlaug, who died 2 or 3 years ago. And Norman Borlaug developed a dwarf variety of wheat. Basically, he asked the question, how can we get greater yield from our growing grain? And the problem was, if you got greater yield with a normal stalk, the weight of the wheat was too heavy, the stalk couldn't support it, and it fell over. Doesn't really work. And he developed a dwarf variety that enabled the world to significantly increase grain production over the last 50 years, more so in some parts of the world than others. And shortly before he died, he observed this. He said, you know, to be growing today the amount of grain that we can produce as a world, if we hadn't had that scientific revolution, would have required an additional area of land the size of Latin America. And it was Mark Twain who famously observed, he said, buy land, because they've stopped making it. And if you want to see the proof of that concern about our ability to feed ourselves in future, look at the countries and the companies who are now buying land in parts of the developing world in just as the same way as countries have bought minerals and mineral rights in recent years, because they are thinking ahead about how are they going to secure food supplies. Question: how will we deal with new pandemics, avian flu, or things like SARS, that could spread right across the globe if they're not dealt with quickly? What are we going to do about the consequences of rapid economic change, inequality, arguments over scarce resources, which can result in violence? Just imagine for a world where people fight not about their politics or their faith, but fight each other for the stuff of life, water. Question: how are we going to protect the biodiversity of our planet? Now, we've come to a point in human history where we've come face to face with the consequences of doing a number of things in a very unsustainable way. That is the story of the first part of the 21st century, whether it is climate, the fact that we can no longer emit CO2 emissions as if there was no consequence at all. The way in which our financial system works, the global crisis of 2008 was a crisis of unsustainability. And the natural world, we have taken, human beings, great achievement has been to interact with the natural world to make extraordinary things happen. But we have taken from the natural world as if it would always be capable of replenishing itself. And we have come now to realise the consequence of doing that, because it doesn't have an infinite capacity to renew itself. And what does the natural world give us? It provides us with food and fuel. It cleans the air. It gives us clean drinking water. It gives us medicines. Just one example of that. About 3 years ago, I was visiting the World Agroforestry Centre in Nairobi, and we went into a laboratory, and there was a table a bit like this, and on it were a number of plants and saplings. And I wandered down, as is my wont, and said, "What's that? What's that?" I said, "What's that?" looking at this rather scrawny sapling. And they said, "Well, now that is Artemisia." And I said, "Aha, now I know a little bit about Artemisia, because someone discovered a few years before that if you combined it with other anti-malarial drugs, you've got a more effective treatment, because the mosquitoes are getting wise to the first generation of anti-malarial treatments." And we went on, and then there was a bit of brown bark. I said, "What's that?" And they said, "Well, that is from the Prunus africa tree." And scientists have discovered that it contains properties that are enabling us to help treat diseases of the prostate and prostate cancer. And I thought about this, and do you know, if you've been walking in the forest somewhere and there had been the only Artemisia sapling in the entire universe here, and over there the only Prunus africa sapling in the world, and you had trampled on them and destroyed them, then these two plants, one that is helping to treat a disease predominantly of the poor world, and one that is helping to treat the disease predominantly of the rich world, would have ceased to exist, and think what we as humankind would have lost. And for that reason, and for lots of other reasons, protecting the natural world and biodiversity is actually fundamental to our future survival as a world. And then there are the impacts of climate change. We see some of them already, others are coming, depending on what we do. Changing weather patterns, floods. And if you think of a country like Bangladesh, most people in Bangladesh live not far above the level of this ceiling, above sea level. And when the floodwaters melt and come down, people have to seek higher ground. Now, if sea levels were to rise in the way that some scientists predict, Bangladesh, population, what, 140 plus million people? What are the people of Bangladesh going to do? I'll tell you exactly what they're going to do. They're going to move house. They're going to go live next door in India. So, if people say, well, yeah, I get you on climate change, Hilary, but this is too difficult to deal with. Well, now there is an example of interdependence. Because human beings are not going to stay to drown. They're going to do what people have always done throughout human history when faced with a threat. They will travel elsewhere to try and make a better life. Now, the challenge is very daunting, and I don't describe those things to depress anybody. I describe them because we've got to be honest about what it is that we're dealing with, if we're going to summon the courage, the energy, the political will and commitment to do something about it. But there is one other point that I want to make, which is what this evening is really all about, and it is this: that without peace and good governance, without stability and order, then we will not defeat poverty and climate change and resource scarcity and feeding the world and famine. And getting that right is absolutely fundamental to the future of human beings on the earth. It's important for all countries. We live in a country where we take it for granted. It wasn't always thus, but we have it now. but especially so for states that are fragile. States where there is violence and corruption, where government is weak and conflict is much more likely. And I was reading the World Bank report from last year, which you referred to, and it says this very simply. 1.5 billion people live in areas affected by fragility, conflict, or large-scale organised criminal violence, and no low-income, fragile, or conflict-affected country has yet to achieve a single one of the United Nations Millennium Development Goals. And the report goes on to say, in bold type, the central message of this report is that strengthening legitimate institutions and governance to provide citizens with security and justice and jobs is absolutely crucial to break cycles of violence. And I could not agree with that more. Indeed, as I reflected on my time as the International Development Secretary, I learned many, many things. But perhaps the most important thing I learned was just how fundamental good governance is to dealing with all of the problems that DFID continues to work on in trying to help people to improve their own lives. And there's lots of good arguments for doing this. One is you're going to have a better chance of meeting the Millennium Development Goals, of getting more children into school, providing more doctors and nurses and drugs and healthcare. The second is it is much less costly time and lives and money if you can forestall the problem rather than having to pick up the pieces later. And when I think of the countries that I spent time working with and visiting, countries that were recovering from conflict, look at a country like Mozambique, a terrible war there, but look at the figures now for the progress that they are making as a country in getting more children into school and improving people's lives. Look at the legacy that violence has left in Sierra Leone. It shares with Afghanistan, certainly did, when I last looked at the figures 3 years ago, the distinction of being the two countries in the world with the highest rates of infant mortality. It is no accident. Children dying not from conflict, but from the legacy of conflict and the lack of governance. And we should acknowledge the efforts that people throughout the world in politics, people providing humanitarian relief, governments, politicians, community leaders, ordinary people make in trying to change things in these most difficult of places. Now, good governance isn't just about the rule of law, it's also about being effective as a government. In a country like the Democratic Republic of the Congo, most people, it's beginning to change, it's slow, it's a long, hard slog, but most people never ever experienced government. Wouldn't know actually what it looked like, because they have been dependent on their own resources, their own efforts to survive. And so we need countries that are capable of doing things for their people, because that ultimately is what government should be about, trying to create the conditions in which an economy can thrive, give people the chance to earn a living. States that listen to what people say they want and then respond. States that can be held to account. The right to choose your leaders. The right to get rid of your leaders if you don't like what they're doing. The right to have a say and the right to be heard. And you only have to look at the pictures we have seen this year from a number of countries in the Arab world. People taking to the streets, calling out for precisely those things, to understand that this is a universal human aspiration. It is not something which is confined to one part of the world or another. It is a universal human right. Now, I wanted just to conclude by talking about the things that we need to do if we are going to make progress. The first is A particularly difficult one for those who hold the cause of peace dear. What do you do about countries where there is conflict and where people's lives are suffering as a result? What do you do in a place like Rwanda when genocide begins? Now this is, for those who abhor violence, a very uncomfortable question to ask. Very. Some people would rather not think about it. What do you do when the RUF and the West Side boys are running around Sierra Leone chopping people's arms and legs off with machetes? What do you do in a place like Kosovo when people are being slaughtered in what is, on one definition, Europe's backyard? Now, I would argue that we have a responsibility as a world, and I know you're going to have, you mentioned a moment ago your meeting on liberal interventionism, humanitarian interventionism, whatever you call it. But I would argue that one of the responsibilities that the world faces is to fashion the will and the means to try and bring safety and security and the right to life to people wherever they happen to live in the world. Because if we think about our own country, we wouldn't accept it if there was peace and stability in London and genocide in Birmingham. And everything was going well in Manchester, but there was a civil war happening in Leeds. Would we think that was right? No, we wouldn't. Why is that not the case? Because we have built the state, we've built the democracy, we have built the rule of law, we have peace and stability. And if that is a universal human right, and I think it is, then the question for us is how do we enable, in particular, the institution we created at the end of the Second World War, the United Nations, expressing values that every single one of us in this room tonight would subscribe to. You only have to read the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to say, yes, well, that is what I believe. But how do we build the capacity and the means to make sure that that applies to all people in all parts of the world? And it is difficult, and it's uncomfortable, and we lack political will, and we are inconsistent, and we are hypocritical sometimes, and we lack the means. But it is a question that I think that we have to ask. Because if we run away from it, then the things, the consequences of violence which we abhor, and which we can see in a lack of development, will continue in parts of the world until we have tackled it. So that is the first point I wanted to make. The second is that we need economic development itself. Now, we used to debate and argue, I know that John is going to be responding in a moment, about this quite a lot. The truth is that on development assistance, on aid, if solving the problem of global poverty in the world was simply a question of writing a big enough cheque, then if you could raise the money, well, it would be quite easy to deal with. But it's not a question of writing a big enough cheque. It is about countries, in the end, for themselves, being able to develop and to prosper. And economic development is a very important part of that, for reasons that everyone here will understand. It's where countries get the resources from to employ the teachers, the nurses, the doctors, to build the clinics and so on. And it is, after all, the story of our own development in this country. If anyone doubts that, go back a couple of hundred years, pause, think what life was like for most people in Britain. Life expectancy was very short, very few children went to school, most people lived in great poverty, there was no health service. And 200 years later, if our forebears and our ancestors were to walk into this room, to wander out into London, to go see the University College Hospital down the road, to visit the primary schools, the secondary schools in the area, to see the standard of living that we have fashioned for ourselves, they would be astonished, absolutely astonished by what we have done. Now, the reason for telling that story is it shows what we can do when we put our minds to it. Now, there have been consequences to the form of our development, and all of that prosperity has been unevenly shared. But it is fundamentally, along with good politics and good governance and reform, how we change the lives of people in this country. It's how we did it. And if it did it for us, then it can do it for others as well. And therefore, Stopping doing things that make economic development in other parts of the world happen is one step that we can take. Trying to achieve that elusive trade deal. Crumbs, how many years have we been saying that, John, is another. The third thing that we need to do is to reach agreement about how we're going to share out the finite resources of the earth. Because what happens to the climate, what happens to natural resources, will be fundamental to the kind of future that we're going to have. And there is a basic question of equity here, which is also uncomfortable, especially for us. Because when I led the delegation, the British delegation, to the climate talks in Bali in 2007, I mean, the problem basically is this: we've had a lot of economic development by burning a lot of carbon. That's what we've done. And it's a bit tricky to go along to people who are aspiring to the same sort of economic development to improve the lives of their own citizens and say, you know, all that stuff that we did, I'm really sorry you can't have any of that now because we used up too much of it. Is that okay with you? And not surprisingly, countries tend to say, not so fast. And yet, the other dilemma we face is this. If we woke up tomorrow morning to discover that the European Union, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, the United States of America, all the OECD countries had miraculously overnight found a way of stopping emitting any CO2 whatsoever. So we became a non-emitter from 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Would we have solved the problem? No, we wouldn't. Why? Because of the concentration of CO2 that is already in the atmosphere and the rising emissions from China and India and other countries as they develop. And finding a formula which balances the contribution that we have to make with the contribution that others have to make, knowing that each of us, frankly, has to contribute according to our ability to contribute, is why the climate negotiations have proved so difficult. But if we don't, in the end, get an agreement that works, then all of us will feel the consequence, because it is not possible to put a net up at the White Cliffs of Dover and say, right, okay, we'll catch the UK emissions, we'll deal with them, could you look after yours, thank you very much indeed. Interdependence. CO2 is astonishingly interdependent. Now, the very last thing I wanted to say was going back to my point about optimism, because they are daunting challenges, and we do face that fundamental choice: are we going to do something or look the other way? And I believe that our history as human beings should encourage us, and we should in particular recognise the progress we've made even in the last 40 years in supporting people to improve their own lives. Indeed, in the last 40 years, life expectancy in the developing world, as you know, has increased by a quarter. In the past 30 years, illiteracy has fallen by half. In the last 20 years, 400 million human beings have been lifted out of absolute poverty. We have beaten smallpox, and we are, I think it's down to about 4 countries now, about this far away from eradicating polio from the face of the earth. Now go back to those forebears and ancestors from 200 years ago, and if you'd said to them, what do you reckon to a world in which we've beaten smallpox, and I think we can get rid of polio too, what would they have said? Because they probably wouldn't have believed it was possible. And therefore we have to have faith in our capacity as rational, sentient human beings to accept the responsibility which the condition of humankind in the 21st century places upon each and every one of us. We have got to say that the prosperity and right to development of people wherever they live in the earth matters. We must summon up all of the skill and ingenuity and innovation and science and determination and passion and creativity and commitment that has characterized human existence on the earth and has enabled us to achieve extraordinary things and to make quite a few mistakes in the process. And the trick in life is to do more of the former and less of the latter. To summon that up and to apply it to the great cause of this century. And the fundamental building block of that is going to be peace and stability. Because, bluntly, you can't do it if you're busy fighting each other, and you can do it if you're prepared to work with each other. And I wish you, and the work that you're doing, every success over the months and years ahead. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Ivan, for excellent speech. And there are many gems. I could pick it out of the speech, but I'm not going to be tempted to do that. And just to say that he very nicely put together the relationship between peace and development by saying that you cannot have development without peace, and you cannot have peace without development. That was great. Okay, now we are very fortunate to have John Hilary with us, who is Director of War and Bond, and he's going to do a response to Right Honourable Hilary Benn's speech, and then I will open up the floor for question and answers. Thank you. John, the floor is yours.
Vijay, thank you very much for inviting me here this evening. It's a great pleasure to be here and to be the sort of first person to open up the floor to respond. And it's a great pleasure also to be able to respond to Hilary Benn's talk. One of the things that Vijay didn't mention, and which I feel most happy about, is in 2005, which many of you know as the Make Poverty History Year, when many of us mobilised up and down the country. And when Hilary Benn was Secretary of State for International Development, one of the key things that he was bold enough to do was to end the conditions that Britain had put on its aid programme. Up until Hilary was in that post, Britain had continued to demand of developing countries that they should open up their markets or privatise their public services as a condition of receiving British aid. And War on Want and many of the public sector trade unions and other people in the country, we were very happy when our campaign was answered that should no longer happen. And that now, as of that moment, British aid cannot be made conditional upon economic policy choices such as privatisation or trade liberalisation. And that was a major step forward, and it added to the previous thing that the Labour government did as soon as it came in, which was to untie British aid. If you think of US aid still at the moment, US aid isn't actually aid going overseas at all. It's aid which comes straight back in a sort of boomerang fashion to American companies, because many of the countries which receive US aid are required to spend that aid on goods and services from US companies. Britain cancelled that under Labour, and again that was a very good thing. And the reason, more than sort of the amounts of money given in aid, is that it made sure that the aid was actually used for the people who need it, the recipients, and not given in our interest. And that's something which I want us to sort of hold on to as we think about where things are going now. Aid was there for the interest and the needs of the people in poor countries, the poorest communities for whom it was really directed. War on Want didn't always agree with the Labour government. We didn't have the same confidence in the Green Revolution, because the Green Revolution, for example, while it did increase productivity in Asia and Latin America, also led to an increase in hunger in both of those continents. And also, as we know now, terrible debt problems which have led to the suicide of 150,000 farmers in India as a result of the debts that they took on caused by the Green Revolution. We didn't share the same confidence, I think, in a trade deal at the WTO. This is the thing which I think we skirmished most on, and we are not so unhappy that it hasn't come to a deal. But the key thing that we disagreed with the Labour government over was its predilection for fighting wars overseas. And particularly, obviously, the legacy of Tony Blair, the Iraq War, which led to hundreds of thousands of deaths, and the war in Afghanistan, which continues today, and as of the week after next will have entered its 10th year, concluded 10 years. Longer than the First and Second World Wars combined. And the result of that is that Afghanistan is now one of the poorest countries in the world. It has the lowest life expectancy. 44 years is the life expectancy in Afghanistan, and indeed the highest infant mortality and maternal mortality rates. And that is for us the most profound failure of the government during the last 20 years. That we have gone to war more and more and more. We've also seen the increased privatisation of war. This is one of the campaigns which War and Wars has led on over the last 6-7 years. The increased use of private military companies, these private military and security companies as they're often called, in doing the dirty work without people knowing about it. And we've seen that not only in Iraq massively, in Afghanistan, but also in Libya, where even before the SAS and the other special forces were involved, you could see that there were private military contractors, mercenaries, working alongside the rebel forces in Libya. But what we're increasingly seeing now as well is the militarization of aid. And this turns on its head the idea that aid is there for the people who need it. Suddenly it's coming back to our interests. And aid and war are being mixed up in a way that they should absolutely never be. Aid is increasingly being used as a weapon to win over the hearts and minds of those populations where we have invaded and whose countries we are occupying. And you've seen that, for example, in Afghanistan, where increasingly aid is being delivered by military units, or provisional reconstruction teams as they're called in Afghanistan. Over half of all aid is actually being delivered not for the people who need it, but for the increased militarisation of the state. And that's been an absolute defining characteristic of British aid in recent times, that we are building up these state forces of our client states often to be able to repel resistance. I was in Palestine just last week actually, and that's another place where the European aid going into the Palestinian Authority has not actually been pushed out into the countryside, but it's been to shore up the state forces. And we actually talked to the representative of the European Commission, and even he was saying that there's been a tremendous skewing of aid away from need and towards the militarisation of the state. And perhaps the worst thing that we've seen in the last year is when Andrew Mitchell, the current Secretary of State for International Development under the Tory regime, has said that 1/3 of all British aid is now directed towards UK security interests. Not towards the interests of the people who need it, but towards British security interests. And indeed, instead of what used to be called post-conflict reconstruction, the reconstruction of states and the whole provision of the basic needs of development, making it possible for development to take place again after conflict, we now have this new word stabilisation as a unit within Whitehall, which has been set up as the stabilisation unit. And the whole thing is about security, stabilisation, and the stronger state, the militarised state. And that, I think, for us is one of the most worrying things of this increased push towards state violence. And interestingly, both Vijay and Hilary mentioned the World Bank's World Development Report, this most recent World Development Report, which is focused on violence around the world. And I was in London when it was being presented by one of its authors, and he was going through the different elements in the report. And it's criminal violence, political violence, drug-fueled violence, all of those sorts of violence, civil war. But there was a sort of great gap. Right? And in the questions afterwards, you seem to have completely missed out state violence, and particularly the state violence of NATO forces around the world, whether it be in Iraq, or in Afghanistan, or Libya. And he said, yeah, well, of course we are the World Bank, so you're not exactly likely to get something which is going to tell you what was actually going on, which is a strange thing for one of the authors to say that. And I think that that's why for us, that the key thing about making possible long-term development, peace, and all of the things that go with it, the human development, the prospects of people being able to develop and see their futures better, is the absence of war. You have to stop waging war on countries if you want there to be peace. And that seems to me the most obvious and easy lesson we take out of all of this. Instead, we're now seeing a situation where NATO countries, including our own, are almost slipping into a casual imperialism. The ability to make war almost as your first reaction. We saw that very much in Libya, where all of us were looking with horror at what was happening in terms of the oppression of the local population. But suddenly to come straight with the answer of bombing and causing more civilian deaths against the UN mandate does not seem to be the right way. And similarly, again, you think about Iraq and Afghanistan, the reasons for going to war in those two places was not given as humanitarian intervention. It was about searching for the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and it was a response to 9/11 in Afghanistan. You can go and read the UK and US submissions to the UN Security Council immediately after war was declared. Obviously, we know that the real causes were much deeper. And if any of you still don't believe that the Iraq war was for oil, I humbly suggest you read Greg Muttett's book, Fuel on the Fire, which I do not have on any commission. This does not come back to me in any way, but all of the text which we were not allowed to see at the time have now been made available. In Afghanistan, I've put some copies at the back of War and Want's new report, looking at the real reasons behind the British invasion and occupation of Afghanistan, and similarly in Libya as well. So I just want to say, for us, the best way to ensure peace is to stop waging war. And that is the call which we need to make to our own government. And I think if you can join us on the 8th of October, War and Want and many other groups are having a mass assembly in Trafalgar Square to mark 10 years of catastrophic conflict in Afghanistan and to say enough is enough. That surely is the message we have to give to our government today, loud and clear, that while they think that they've not got enough money to do public services or public sector jobs or all of the things which we hold dear in this country, they still have enough to spend £12 million every single day bombing Afghanistan. I think those are the choices we need to make. We need to make them very clear. Thank you.
I'm going to open the floor and start taking questions. Okay, I can see a couple of hands here. Tom, Lakshan, and the gentleman at the back. Three.
Okay, sure.
Okay, we'll take 3 questions at a time. You, Tom, Lakshan, and the gentleman at the back. Can you give your names and the organization, if you have got, you belong to?
Okay, my name's Tom Cuthbert. I'm from tonight East Midlands CMB, which of course in which Chesterfield resides. I've been greetings from Chesterfield, Hillary, if I may be so bold. Thank you. The question: with global military expenditure still expressed in telephone numbers and some expenditure on Trident and decisions on Trident confirmed, and our economic stagnation confirmed, can you sympathise with the disappointment that many feel when Jim Murphy offers a view that nuclear weapons have been a cornerstone of the UK's misnamed peace and security policy for more than 50 years? And another strand, you talk about climate change very movingly and about finite resources. But an answer that this government and the previous government have to climate change is more nuclear power. Could you express a view about that?
Yeah. So, thanks, Tom. Lakshan?
I'm from the United Nations Association. All the way I came from Cumbria in the north. 2 questions, if I may. Hillary. One is about the Millennium Development Goals, and secondly about the current position for peace if Palestine is successful in becoming a member state. Now, on the question of Millennium Development Goals, I know you were very much involved when you were in office, but do you think the present HMG is doing enough because there's less than 4 years to go to hopefully hit the main targets. We are working very hard in schools in the Northwest, trying to educate the importance of the development goals. Do you think the 10 targets are too ambitious? That's my question. And secondly, on Palestine, is the British government currently going to back the Security Council with the Palestinian membership?
Thank you. Gentleman back. Did you want to ask a question? Yes.
Actually, it's just been asked. Just on Palestine, you spoke very movingly. Sorry, I've got to introduce myself. My name is Usman Nawaz. I'm a Faith Sachs Fellow of the Tony Blair Faith Foundation, based up in Malaria, Normal, UK, working to create interfaith cohesion in the UK through raising awareness of malaria and raising funding for malaria. My question specifically, the gentleman just alluded to as well on Palestine. You spoke very movingly about bringing safety, security and stability, and believe that it was a human right, and indeed I agree with that, and I'm not sure anybody would disagree. But during this UN General Assembly week, do you not believe it's right that the Palestinian people should also have their right to safety and security, and do you think that's best served through their bid for saving their nation?
Thank you.
Well, I've just, Lisa's just given me a note saying, do you want us to respond to John also? But there are lots of things that I would like to say, some of which may come out in the course of the Q&A. But can I deal with the first three questions? Tom, first of all, I shall convey your greetings from Chesterfield to the former Member of Parliament when I next see him, indeed on Sunday at the Labour Party conference when I'm meeting him off the train. In Liverpool. Look, on Trident, I'd simply say this, that we have shown as a world some capacity to make progress in reducing the stock of nuclear weapons and warheads, including, it happened under the last Labour government, as you will be aware. First point. Secondly, however, in the differently dangerous world in which we now live, and that's what I think, and you may not agree with me, do I think if we were ourselves unilaterally to renounce, and I've thought long and hard about this, do I think it would encourage the other nuclear states to follow suit? No, I don't. And that includes those who have signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty and those who have not signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Do I think in itself it would make us safer in a differently dangerous world? No, not really. But what we have seen, including through the talks between the United States of America and Russia, that it is possible through negotiation to make progress. And I want a non-nuclear world, nuclear weapon world, just as much as you do, but I have a different view about how we try and reach that. On nuclear power, look, all forms of energy production have a consequence, all of them. All I'd say about nuclear power is this: climate change changes things. And the fact is, if you look at power plants in operation, and I know there are issues about construction, and I know that there are issues about waste, although we have dealt with the waste that we've produced through a nuclear program since, the first power station opened, in the late 1950s. The fact is, in operation, a nuclear power station produces about 40 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. A gas-fired power station produces about 385 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour, and a coal-fired power station is about 700-800. Question: which of those three forms of energy generation is the lowest carbon? Now, we have got a lot of our electricity from nuclear power in this country for a number of years. Heavens, you go across the Channel to France, it's 80%. And the Germans are not going to have a nuclear power program anymore, but I suspect that they might be buying some nuclear generated electricity from France. So my view is simply this, that in the fight against climate change, we need all of the means at our disposal. And we gave a big boost to renewables when we were in government, but you do need baseload capacity, because when we all go home and turn on the telly and start cooking at 7 o'clock in the evening, you've got to have a form of power generation that can kick in there and then, and fundamentally you have three choices: nuclear, coal or gas. There are also questions about security. We have a declining amount of oil and gas ourselves. We've benefited enormously from the sea oil. But if you want to know what it feels like when someone else has got their hand on the gas tap, then go and talk to the Belarusians or the Ukrainians, because they can tell you what it feels like when someone else has got their hand on the gas tap. So I think for all of those reasons we need a balanced range of sources of energy generation, and that has led some people who were opposed to nuclear power before, when they didn't think it was necessary because there were other ways of generating energy, to change their minds because climate change has changed things. On your question, sir, about the Millennium Development Goals, are they too ambitious? No, they're not. Because when you look at them, why would you want to say, I don't think we should be trying quite so hard to make quite so much progress? They have been a very powerful motivating force. The whole point about a target is it's something that you aim for. Have you got plans in place as a world to do something about it? But it's very clear that we are not making enough progress, but that is not an argument for giving up. And as both of you raised Palestine, I don't know what the British government is going to decide, because as of earlier today it had offered no view as to how it would vote if President Abbas puts a motion to the UN this week. But I think the British government should support Palestinian bid for statehood. Indeed, that is what Douglas Alexander said to the Labour opposition earlier this week in a letter that he wrote to William Hague. It is not a choice, in my view, between agreeing that and somehow sacrificing in the course of it the prospect of negotiations. I don't see that it's a conflict between the two at all. We need negotiations, but frankly they have been going nowhere for far too long, and we need a resolution to that problem. If I may, following your invitation, just briefly comment on some of the things that John said. One is that we can debate and argue, as I'm sure we will, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya. Well, I have to say, now you may argue, John, that Gaddafi was not poised to enter Benghazi and kill people. You may argue that. I don't know whether you would. And the question is a very practical question, because if we were sitting here in London and someone was about to come in here and threaten to kill us all, we'd be looking for some practical assistance, that's the truth. And the question is, who do you ring up to ask for help? And if the person at the end of the phone says, well, it's all jolly difficult and I'm really sorry and I know it's tough, but this would be an expression of imperial militarisation and we're not going to do it, the person on the other end would say, that was a fat lot of use, and put the phone down. And the question is, the judgment you have to make in those circumstances, what do you do? And the same was true in Kosovo, and I noticed that you didn't mention Kosovo in your list, because that's another difficult one. Were we right or wrong to go in to try and prevent what we were seeing on our television screens? Now, I respect those who say I'm opposed to taking any action in any circumstances whatsoever, but there is a consequence to that, which includes conflict and people losing their lives. So it's not as if someone is arguing here, I'm in favour of nobody losing their lives, and you're in favour of people losing their lives. The fact is, we have to make choices in those circumstances. And the reason why I express that view is because there is, as you know, better than anyone else, a terrible consequence for poverty from conflict, whatever its cause. And the second point I just wanted to respond to is what you said about building up of state forces, which made it sound quite sort of sinister. But if you look at Afghanistan, and don't forget, when the Taliban were there, and they were a pretty violent and unpleasant lot, and when they were in power, remember, about 4 million Afghans fled the country. They voted with their feet. Most of them went to Pakistan and Iran. Some of them came to my constituency in Leeds. I have a number of Afghan asylum seekers and those who've been granted leave to remain. They had a very clear view about what they thought of the Taliban. But if you accept the argument, and I hope that you would, that building the capacity of a state to provide security and good governance and the rule of law in Afghanistan, it's an enormously big task. Huge. Then to criticise those who are trying to support countries in the end to be able to do that for themselves is, in my view, the wrong approach to take. Because what the Afghans want is to be able to manage their own security and deal with the threat from the Taliban without having to rely on the support of those who are there, the international coalition which is there present. And therefore, if you're serious about development, and you are, and I am, there's a range of things that you need to do. And it's not just a question of saying, well, we'll concentrate on the food and the education and the healthcare if the lack of governance, the lack of security, the lack of a state that is capable of protecting its citizens means that none of those things are really going to survive and prosper. And so I would, in a gentle way, and the great thing about John is that all the years that we've debated, as you can tell from the spirit of the conversation, he says what he thinks and I say what I think, is I think that it doesn't quite capture the importance of enabling people and governments to provide that security, because actually it's fundamental to long-term peace and stability and development.
Thank you. Well, that's what we call democracy.
Indeed.
Few things. I want to get as many people who would like to ask a question. So I've got this request to make. Keep your comments and questions short. And also a request to our Honourable Hilary Benn to keep your answers short.
I'm duly admonished. Yeah.
Okay, Donald Prentice at the back, that lady at the back, and that gentleman. Yeah.
Donald Prentice, ship peace practitioners. I've got a question that over the last decade we've seen lots of genuine efforts from government departments, Department of International Development, the Ministry of Defence and so on, to resolve a lot of challenges. Many of them have been outmanoeuvred by the spoilers, usually new hybrid challenges which seem to evade the brains of our best generals. Has there been any attempt to capacity build to deal with new strategies or lessons learned from that wonderful, virtuous decade of the 90s, so that we can have a peace strategies unit that we can actually deliver training and data capture that will allow us to have the capacity to deal with the spoilers?
Thank you. The lady over there, it's you.
Okay.
You wrote again.
Hello, my name is Susan Barlow. I work for an organisation called CORD, we're an international peace building organisation. Very simple question. In recent saw a statistic in the Royal Party parliamentary report on conflict issues, where for every £1 spent on conflict prevention, there's £2,000 spent on military spending, and I just was curious as to why conflict prevention wasn't higher on the political agenda.
Thank you. Good question. Gentleman here, yes? Yes, go on.
A few questions I'd like to ask.
Can you tell us who you are?
Oh yes, my name is Alan Blood, and I'm a member of the Campaign Against Arms Trade and Peace Trade Union, and support dozens of other organisations, several organisations. And I think we should learn from history. There are too many divided nations today. You have a divided Cyprus, a divided Ireland just across the water from here, divided Korea, and a number of other countries that are divided. Germany has been united a few years ago, but if we look back at Switzerland, back to history, 200 years ago, before that, through the Middle Ages, the French speakers who were refugees and Jews of the Roy, who occupied the borders, lands between France and Italy, and the German speakers from the other part, which the most famous one we all know about, Brutal, of course, and they fought each other for centuries and they came together, and they've been a united nation since the end of the Napoleonic Wars. And not
so
only that,
what is the question?
both the Protestants and Catholics live together peacefully, and they've been neutral. And that's the thing. I think Palestine, Israel, was one country between the two world wars, occupied by Britain, but there has been been defined a bit like another dividing wall, like East and West Germany, which are totally united and call itself Israel. There's Palestine. After all, New Zealand has two names. It's got the Maori name, it's got the English name. The other thing is, I think one of our slogans, we should remember, and this was a slogan, I said this to the other organisation belong to, was the immortal words of Harry Patch, who died a couple of years ago, at the age of 112, and he was a veteran of the First World War, and he says, war is a licence to commit murder, and nothing could be more true. The only people who benefit from wars are the wealthy warmongers, and the rest, misery for masses.
Thank you. Good comment.
Right, thanks. If I could respond to Donald and Susan's question, I don't mind me being familiar. I've always said you can call me whatever you like, the attorney. That is the deal, and people sometimes do. Donald, I think we do try and learn the lessons, and that includes discussion with the military. One of the things that was striking about my job as International Development Secretary is I found myself working, obviously, with the Foreign Office, but also with the military in a number of countries. And we brought together the money that we put into trying to tackle conflict, something called the conflict pool, and it links to Susan's question about conflict prevention, precisely because we wanted to work together, the military, foreign policy, development assistance, humanitarian aid, in a way that made sense in relation to the countries that we were dealing with. And the more evidence that we can produce and show that that kind of work helps, we can't solve the problems in other countries. In the end, other countries have to solve them for themselves. But I've seen with my own eyes that the support that is given by Britain and other countries can make a real difference. And that includes the stabilisation unit that John referred to, which is also about trying to build capacity to support countries in improving their own ability to govern themselves after there has been a conflict. And some of the expenditure on military, of course, there are people who are being paid for by the MOD who are working on conflict prevention alongside the money. So I think it depends how you define that. Alan, well, Switzerland indeed has a long and interesting history and is a neutral country, and that's the choice that they've made. But I would say there are times when we can't say we're neutral, and I think September 1939 was such a moment. And while my view of the First World War is different from my view of the Second World War, there are people who argue very strongly that if we let Hitler get on with it, then frankly the consequences wouldn't have been worth living with. And I say that having lost an uncle, my dad's older brother, in the Second World War. On divided nations, just a final comment. The lesson that I think we've learned, particularly from Northern Ireland, each conflict is different and has its own history. But what enabled a breakthrough to happen in Northern Ireland was when the leaders of the parties to the conflict finally said, each to their own side, look, we know the history, we know where we've come from, the grievance, the violence that has been done to us, the suffering we have endured. But this is what we now need to do in the interests of a peaceful future. And what Jerry Adams and Martin McGuinness did, what David Trimble did, leading those respective communities, was the single most important change that enabled the Northern Ireland peace process to progress. Because you can either get peace by completely defeating the other side militarily, or you can do it by compromising and realising that you have to live together. And in the case of Palestine, the Palestinian Authority and Israel, currently there isn't yet the leadership to enable that to happen. I long for the day when it does, because without it the problem isn't going to be solved.
Thank you. Just a comment that I've been many times to Belfast and had day sessions. I've met these hunger strikers and the people who've been in the prison and everything. It's absolutely right what Ingrid just said, that people also need to be fed up with the violence which is going on a daily basis before they can sit down. They've got to feel that the violence has to stop before they can sit down and have a dialogue. And that was, I think, in a way, was the Good Friday agreement. Okay, open again for 3 more questions. Brian Cooper, yeah, yourself and the lady. Okay, Brian.
I come from Scotland. In 3 or 4 years' time, there's a strong possibility that Scotland might vote to be independent of the rest of the United Kingdom. So that response is significant, because there's a great deal of misunderstanding now, growing misunderstanding, much encouraged by the Scottish nationalists. The Scottish nationalist case is predicated on the economic foundation that Scotland would take control of North Sea oil. I wonder if any Westminster government will ever agree to that.
The second one was the lady over there. Yes. Is it gentleman or lady? I can't see properly. Yes, you are pointing out. Yes. I see.
Trevor Evans from the United Nations Association.
Okay, right.
The main message I take from what you said is that we need to try to replace the vicious circle of violence and conflict and poverty and replace it with a virtuous circle of peace and development. And I wonder whether you would agree that we need to look for opportunities and initiatives that can help to break that vicious circle. And I'd like you to comment on what you think about the opportunities provided by today, the United Nations Day of Peace, and the truce that is called for today and largely ignored probably, but also the more ambitious truce that is being asked for the forthcoming Olympic Games, which our government will be proposing at the United Nations within the next 2 weeks, I think, and is, I understand, trying to put forward more ambitious, greater ambitions for peace-building opportunities in that resolution.
Thank you very much. The man from Milton Keynes. Remind me your name again.
Fazil.
Okay.
Fazil Kunka from Peace and Justice Network, Milton Keynes, and from the Interfaith MK. My question is that while I agree with largely your particular approach to the various questions which you have outlined very clearly, what I would like to ask is that Robin Cook spoke of an ethical foreign policy. Now, while these interventions were perhaps necessary, as you have outlined, what seems completely unexplainable and also probably totally unethical is where arrangements have been made with certain countries where you don't normally have very good relations with, but nonetheless their torture procedures at prisons has been extremely effective, and prisoners have been transferred to them by this country, the United States as well, and how this type of situation, which comes as a shock to so many of us, even of moderate leanings, is a matter of some concern, and I don't know whether you'd like to comment on that.
Thank you.
May I deal with the first one and kind of work backwards, if that's okay? On the specific point that you've raised about prisoners, there is the Gibson inquiry and it will answer the questions. But the British government, when we were in government, were very clear, we do not and did not transfer people to other countries where they may be subject to violence, torture or execution. And reading some of the coverage in The Guardian recently of the papers that have been uncovered in Libya, you have to look very carefully to distinguish between what they are saying the United States of America did, and politicians in America are responsible for what America did, and politicians in Britain are responsible for what Britain did or didn't do. Because the impression is somehow given that in some of those cases we transferred people, the act of it, whereas as I read it, it was not actually saying that. Now, the inquiry will determine the answer. And indeed, you can look at many cases that have gone before the courts in Britain where we have made it clear that we would not transfer people to the country because we take our international responsibilities seriously. And I think it's important to make that point. The second thing I would say about ethical foreign policy is this, and I alluded to it when I talked about hypocrisy, inconsistency and so on. But I make this very, very simple point to those who sometimes criticise action that is taken. Just because you can't do the right thing everywhere is not, in my view, a terribly good argument for not trying to do the right thing when you can. And because if you take the view that because you cannot solve all of the problems of the world, including all of the conflicts, now you say to anyone who you might be able to help, I'm really sorry, but I'm morally compromised, I can't do anything, it doesn't strike me as a very good argument. And the reason it's not a very good argument is the person who might have the benefit of some assistance, and it's the argument about Libya, I don't think would find it a very good reason either. And I just make that observation. Trevor, well, I do agree. I think your summary of what I was trying to say in a much pithier way than I managed is a very good one. And the importance of the UN Day of Peace, the fact that it makes us come together and have this discussion and think about it is really, really important. There are two things you need to do. One is you need to disarm the weapons. In Mozambique, as I'm sure you know, they have there's this guy who turns Kalashnikovs into art and furniture. It's very disconcerting. I've sat in one of his chairs, and the arms are the barrel of a Kalashnikov. So you put your hand on the armrest, and there are two barrels pointing at wherever you're having a conversation. So you feel like you need to turn your chair, but that is swords into plowshares. But the most important thing you have to do is to disarm people's minds, because it's the mind that decides whether to pull the trigger or not, to fight or to debate and discuss. And that is the most important thing. Now, people have grievances, there are causes, there are disputes, some people oppress others, and, well, I touched on all of that when I spoke. Now, Brian, it's a very interesting question you raised. I was listening to a bloke on the radio the other day, and he said, actually, he said, I suspect if you had a referendum now, in England, the English people might vote to say to Scotland, well, if that's how you feel, off you go, and the Scots would probably vote to stay as part of the United Kingdom. Now, anyway, that was an observation that they made. My personal view is I would be very surprised if the people of Scotland were to vote for complete independence, because devolution, and the Labour government brought about devolution, having asked the Scottish people what they wanted in a referendum, has given Scotland a very large measure of self-government, recognising that it always had it in many respects with a separate legal system, education system, and so on and so forth. But from an economic point of view, Alex Salmond, as we know, used to talk about the arc of prosperity, running from Ireland through Scotland to Iceland. That was before October 2008. And if October 2008 had happened and Scotland had been an independent state, what would they have been able to do for the Royal Bank of Scotland? And what that tells you is, we're interdependent, and actually coming together to support one another, to be part of something bigger, whether it's Scotland and Wales and England being part of the United Kingdom, or the United Kingdom being part of the European Union, or all of the countries of the world being part of the United Nations. That protection and assistance it gives you is actually very, very important in a dangerous and sometimes uncertain world. But it will be for the people of Scotland to take that decision.
The question I ask you is if they do vote for independence, and the problem is, the reason why Salmond is putting it off, last possible moment, is that the groundswell among young people, up to the age of mid-30s, a strong majority in favour. And he is hoping that the more years pass, more unionists will die off, more young people will be independent. This is a democratic fact. Now, if that happens, my view is that the English, Welsh or Valley government would send the Navy to protect the North oil rigs. Would that be the case or not, do you think?
Look, that is what's known in the trade as a very hypothetical question, and tempting though it is to encourage me to embark down that and answer on that course of action. Personally, I don't believe it's going to happen. How much North Sea oil gas is still going to be left at that time because the supplies are diminishing? Where do you draw the line? Whose oil is it anyway? Where are the territorial waters? These are all quite tricky questions. But the great motivating force in the 70s was indeed Scotland's oil. That was the argument. We're getting to a point where it probably won't be anybody's oil because there won't be very much of it left.
Thank you. Brian, that has been done 100 years ago when Liverpool was the most radical city in the world. And the British government did send military to Liverpool to quell the riots. That has happened in the English history already. And the second thing is, Hillary said we could differ with him. So I'll just make always our special guest for today. That just the point I'd like to make is about the ethical foreign policy. That it's okay for us to intervene in Libya because of the high quality of gas and oil, but not okay to say anything about Saudi Arabia and Bahrain and other areas. Just a comment. Because and Yemen, yes. Yeah, thank you very much. So just a reflection on that. Three more questions, please. Liz, the lady over there, and the lady here. Okay, I'll see this side now, and then I'll go to that side in a minute. Liz, you first.
I'm the Director of the Fellowship of Reconciliation. Just a short question. You seem to put some faith in the United Nations. Simple questions. How can we democratize and reform that most undemocratic institution, the United Nations, in particular the Security Council?
Can you tell us who you are and from where?
I'm Willie Walker from World Vision UK, one of the major implementing agencies of DFID's Fragile States work. And I've personally been reviewing those projects recently. I'm just curious about the point, you didn't really come back to address his point about militarization of aid. He described it as aid as a weapon, and could you readdress that? I think, just thinking about what we as NGOs do in those fragile states, I think we're very grateful that we've got easier access to funds, but there seems to be a lack of synergy between action by NGOs, the British foreign policy, the political agenda, and what seems to be going on with the arms trade. And how do we seek the sort of synergy there? What is the agenda in actual fact? And do you think that it's going to head towards aid for resources and that kind of trade-off?
Thank you, good question. Mary Hale?
I'd just like to ask both of our speakers if they are aware of the activities being planned by Northern Gold for the marking the Olympic truce, 100 days of truce in this country. There are a lot of very interesting things going on. If they know anything about this, they could talk to us about it.
Thank you. Yes. Okay. Yes.
I like living in a world where we have the law and governance and so on. But I'm deeply aware that for many people the state is not a benign force at all. And if you took Central and Eastern India, which I know a little bit about, but the state really acts against people all the time there, and the state colludes with economic forces so that people lose their land and so on for developers. I'd like you to say, could you say, first of all, whether the UK should be more critical, for instance, of the Indian government, whether the UN should be, and also something about the economic forces, which in my view cause an enormous lot of conflict in the world, and that's what people suffer from, as well as military forces. Thank you.
On your question about, did you say Northern?
More than.
Oh, more than gold, I beg your pardon. I don't, straight up, I don't know a lot about that. Indeed, I don't know much about it at all. So there may be others in the room who can answer the question, or maybe you could enlighten me, either by responding or when we have finished. How do we democratise the United Nations? Well, alluded to the point about the makeup of the Security Council, because the current makeup of the Security Council does not reflect, the modern world in which we live, and I support changes to bring other member states on board. There is an argument about who would, how many seats from which parts of the world, from Latin America, talking about permanent members here, Africa, who would get the African seat? Would it be Nigeria? Would it be South Africa? Would it be somebody else? But it is true of the United Nations, it's true of the other international institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, because they were created at a particular moment in history, arising out of the ashes of the Second World War. They are not properly constituted for a world at the beginning of the 21st century. So I would strongly support changes to bring that about. The militarisation of aid, and I'm sorry I didn't respond to that earlier. If you are trying to deliver aid in circumstances where there is, conflict still going on and it's dangerous, it's difficult, I have to say I took, as the Development Secretary, a fairly pragmatic view. Now I know there is an argument which says under no circumstances should aid be seen anywhere near someone who's got a beret and a uniform. But in truth, in some parts of the world, and it's true in Afghanistan, frankly those who are opposing this process, oppose international forces, oppose the elected Afghan government, oppose a lot of things that it is doing, frankly they don't care very much whether it's an aid worker that they attack and shoot, or somebody wearing a beret and a uniform. If they get the chance, they'll try and kill both of them. And therefore, it's not the point to say, well, you've made that happen because the aid arrived in the company of a soldier. My view is that isn't the point, because the people doing that have got a different agenda. And therefore, if that is what is required to get help to people, then that's what we should do. Now, some people may call that the militarisation of aid, and I call it being practical about getting assistance to where it's needed. When I went to Somalia, I was the first Western politician to visit Somalia for 12 years in 2006-07, talking to the UN there about the difficulties they had in delivering humanitarian assistance, the World Food Programme, what they had to put up with, how they tried to deal with it. I came away with enormous respect for what they're doing. The second point I'd make is that John kindly talked about what we did as a government to anti-aid, and I remain resolutely and firmly committed to that, and it was Claire Short who gets the credit for having put that on the statute book, because we must not go back to confusing. Are we doing this because it's actually in our commercial interests, and you made the point, John, very well, or is it about helping people to improve their own lives? And your question, Madam, about states acting against their people, well, when it comes to development, and includes economic development, there are difficult choices a country face. Now, India is a democracy, it takes its own decisions, it makes it very clear to the United Kingdom that it is a democracy and it will take its own decisions, and it doesn't take terribly kindly to attempts to lecture by its former colonial master, and I think we can well understand that given the history. But when it comes to economic development, you might say, this is going to happen here, it is going to have an impact on the people who live here, but we think it's in our greater benefit. Where do you build power stations? Where do you provide factories? And that process of change is very hard for people to deal with. And I think decisions like that can only really be taken within the political system of the country itself. I don't think that I can, from afar, say, yeah, I think that's a good idea, or no, I don't agree with that. That has to be sorted out by the democracy, the debate, and the politics of the country itself.
I'm not going to stand up for India, but just to say that the Indian government or Indian leaders put objection to international rules and regulations for the simple reason because they find it discriminating. But I'm not going to go into that debate. Okay, 3 more questions, please. It's that side I'm going to take now, please. That lady at the back, that gentleman there. Anyone more? Third one? Okay, the lady there. Okay. Yes. Can you speak a bit louder?
I would like to follow on your statements about the Security Council. Now, there have been very many efforts to reform the Security Council for years, and it is terribly difficult, given the structure of the institution and the veto and this and that, and the interests of the great powers that face it. Now, should we not consider doing something more actively about the General Assembly? UNGA was formed by Alison Williams, and UNGA was a civil society link with civil organisations, non-governmental organisations, civil society organisations, to have a presence at the United Nations linked to the General Assembly. Should we not be constructively looking more at the contribution of civil society at the global level? That's one question.
Thank you.
The other question concerns what can be done more positively about state building. There was a trusteeship council, well, obviously we're not going back to the days of mandated territories, but the General Assembly could in fact reenact this trusteeship council through votes amongst the member states themselves, and the trusteeship council use some of the expertise that we have coming out of the universities in terms of politics and economics and culture. What could be done more positively? Because Libya is in a mess. I mean, whether we like it or not, it's in a mess. And it's a strictly authoritarian government. How the heck do we think we're going to build democracy?
Okay.
They have no political parties to begin with.
Thank you very much. Yes.
My name is Adnan. I am a research student of international relations. My question is to Sir Kant, is about that the state aid towards other states are normally paid by state national interest. So please suggest to devise the strategy to avoid that kind of discrepancies towards the national interest paid towards the aid. Normally the state, when they aid towards any other state, it's been paid by national interest. So how can we avoid it?
Thank you. Did you get the rest?
I think so, yeah.
Okay. Okay, the lady over there.
I am also a research student, not originally from this country. I came here to live because I really admire the United Kingdom and what it represents, but I've been studying non-violent action, and we were discussing how like the protests that took place before the war in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Thank you.
But like recently, the census, like the form that was sent to this computer that was actually provided by an armed trade dealer and leader. Yeah. And I was wondering, like all these actions, non-violent actions that people have been doing in this country to protest against government's policies, foreign policies, have not been answered. And I was wondering whether, except for violence, what choice do people have here to make their governments listen when they don't have a choice?
Thank you. Good question.
Thanks. Well, you're absolutely right about the difficulties of reforming the UN Security Council. Tricky questions like who's hanging on to the veto? Would new member states be given one? Now, to be blunt about this, if you said to some countries in the world, right, we're reforming the UN Security Council, you're no longer going to have a veto, then the risk is they might say, right, we're off. Now, you have to decide whether you think that would matter or not, but it's a very practical problem that has to be addressed. I think the easiest way to make progress, but that's not to say it isn't incredibly difficult, is to add to the numbers of permanent members to reflect, as I said in answer to the earlier question, that we have become. Secondly, in all of these international organisations, in my experience, voluntary organisations, third sector organisations play a more important role. I think it'd be quite hard to work out how you're going to constitute it, but some of those bodies, they do have representatives already of the voluntary sector who get the chance to speak. And certainly I've been at many international gatherings where that was the case. They are important voices, the voice of the third sector, the voice of business, the voice of labour and others, alongside the voice of governments, because in the end, a country, when it comes to voting, has to speak with one voice, and the way we do that is on the basis of whoever happens to be the government. Now on Libya, well, you're right, the task of state building is going to be absolutely enormous. You're right, they don't have political parties as we understand it. They are coming out of a period of great difficulty. Ultimately, it's for them to sort that out, for us to offer assistance if we can, but I'm sure those who have been celebrating on the streets would say, well, at least we're in a better place to deal with that now than we were when Colonel Gaddafi was ruling us. State aid and the national interest, the question that you asked. Well, the best thing you can do is to untie your aid in the way that we did, and we passed a bit of legislation, the International Development Act in Britain, to make that absolutely clear. So it's in statute, in law, that you can't do what previous governments had done in Britain. The most famous example was the Pergau Dam, where Britain gave aid to build a dam because our companies were going to get the contracts. Now it was that scandal which led to the argument about untying, which led us to say, right, we're going to legislate so that doesn't happen again. And I'm very proud of the part that we played. The second thing I would say is that aid and support can be given in different ways in different circumstances, and it's very important to acknowledge that. From what's called budget support over here, where basically you give money to a government to add to its money, it gets on and spends it on teachers, doctors, nurses, whatever. Over here, you have a humanitarian assistance working through NGOs, churches and others, because you don't want to give any money to the government at all, because there's a problem of corruption or whatever, and certain points in between. And as the International Development Secretary, I had a responsibility to make sure that our money was going for the purpose for which it was intended, and you have to make a judgment depending on the circumstances as you find them. Well, on the protests, in fact, I'm just writing an article about this at the moment. Yes, a lot of people protested in the run-up to the Iraq War. If you'd been in the chamber of the House of Commons on that day, you would have found the arguments in favour of the action and against the action being expressed. Quite a number of MPs voted against it, and I would say on that occasion the views that were being expressed in the country were reflected in the debate that we have. We have a democracy. Now, if you didn't like what Saddam Hussein was doing, you couldn't do much about it. And if you got up and expressed a view, he'd do something about you. If you don't like what I do, and you happen to come and live in the Leeds Central constituency, you'd be very welcome. It's a wonderful place. You could at the next election say, I really don't like that man, I'm not voting for him, and you can vote for someone else. And at that moment, you are as powerful as me, because we each get one cross on the ballot paper. So that is the answer to the question. But the second point I'd make this is that sometimes in society we're quite selective about the causes that we protest about. It was very striking during the conflict in Darfur how little protest there was in this country about what was going on in Darfur. And you looked around and said, well, where is everybody? People are losing their lives, there's terrible conflict. Now, I wonder whether one of the reasons for the absence of protest about Darfur was because the two countries in the world that were doing the most to try and solve the problem was one, the United Kingdom, and two, the United States of America. So, did that influence whether people came out into the streets to say, are you going to deal with this terrible conflict? So, we can be accused of picking and choosing, and people do. In return, one can accuse others of picking and choosing about what they think is important and what they protest about. And it's important that if we feel something is wrong, we talk about it wherever it's happening. Sorry.
Thank you. Yeah, just further adding on to what Hilmi just said, most of the great things in the world have happened non-violently. including the Indian independence movement, the civil rights movement in the United States, and all the revolutions, the Velvet, the Orange, and all that happened in Eastern Europe. All these have happened non-violently. So carry on with the non-violent acts. Okay, and now let's have another 3 questions, but from this side this time. The lady over there, the lady here, and is another one from here, otherwise I'll take one from that side. And okay, okay, and the lady there. Before you start with your questions, I've got 2 things to tell you. One, because it's the United Nations International Day of Peace, the cameraman is just giving me a note to say, if some of you would like to share your thoughts on what you have been doing for peace, he is ready to take 1 or 2 minute interviews, whoever has got the energy left and is still awake now at this hour of the evening. So they are most welcome to come and do it. And secondly, because we said to your office that you are going to be till 8:30, unless you wish to stay till 9 o'clock, but I think you haven't even got water here. So he's got nothing, no drinks to replenish himself. So I think we will call this a last set of questions, yeah? So the lady here, the lady there, and the 3 ladies, very good.
It's Victoria Smalling from the Commonwealth Countries League. And so the question of trade versus aid, because of all that you said about aid, it's quite clear that often the aid doesn't benefit the countries as much as it should do or could do. And many of them are an increase in trade rather than aid. So what prevents that happening?
Okay, thank you. And the lady there?
My name is Monica Morris. I'm an international relations student. I spent the summer in Tanzania in Africa, and a lot of tribes and just general people there rely on spiritual, and they're all part of clans and things like this. They have beliefs and have certain ways towards human rights. So I'm just wondering how you feel that these people, as they are all in poverty, how they're going to actually be able to follow through development with things such as human rights. Because I'll give you an example. The Maasai tribe, they still fully believe in female circumcision, and I went to one of the only seminars. Like, it took years to get the Maasai to agree to go to the seminar, but when they're there, they don't even understand the concept of sending their children to school. So how do you think these groups in society are actually going to be able to cope with people trying to tell them to send their children to school and things like that?
Thank you. And the lady over there?
Hello, I'm Bryony from called the same as Susan who spoke earlier, Peace Building Charity in Midlands. I'm a fundraiser, so I mean I don't know, it's quite a basic question in comparison to the other ones that have been asked. We're all here tonight, we've got a common interest, we're concerned citizens looking to campaign for peace. What I really want to know is, for me, the challenge is about converting people that just aren't really interested and aren't engaged. Perhaps they put a high value on pursuing a financial sort of course in life and succeeding, you know, with prosperity. They don't really see that they're interconnected and they're living like quite a single track life. I think it's also quite difficult to get accurate information from the media about what's really going on in countries. So I think a lot of people aren't very engaged. And I want to know, when we all go away from here tonight, how are we going to set about disarming those minds, as you said? Thanks.
Thank you. Good question.
Very good question. Victoria, first of all, well, what prevents progress? The answer is self-interest prevents progress. Take the European Union. You know, the European Union created a common agricultural policy that was, well, part of the glue that brought Europe together. We should just observe in passing, of course, the creation of the European Union was fundamentally a political objective to try and stop a continuation of slaughter and conflict in Europe. And for 60 years it's been pretty darn successful, and long may it continue to be so. But the deal was free trade in industrial goods and a system which would support even the least efficient farmers. And out of that came subsidies, tariffs, dumping surplus products on the world market and undercutting farmers in the developing world. Now, some changes have been made as a result of efforts countries like Britain and others, but we still haven't quite kicked the habit when it comes to export subsidies. The same is true of cotton. The West African cotton producers, the United States of America and others. So it is about trying to persuade people that you can come to a deal in which everybody is going to benefit in some shape or form. It is very, very tricky and difficult because not every country has the same interest, and some developing countries, as they're still described, have very different interests from some other poorer developing countries. I mean, that's part of the story. It's also true in climate, because China is at a very different state of economic development to Mali or Burkina Faso. Very, very different. And the idea that we should see them as one mass called developing countries doesn't actually describe the differentiation which there now is in the world. How long were you in Tanzania for?
2 months.
2 months. Well, female circumcision, what one can do is, to make the case, we play our part. A bit of legislation we passed in Britain in 2 phases. The first said it was illegal to engage in female circumcision here in Britain, and then a Conservative MP by the name of Marion Rowe, I was writing about her today, proposed a private member's bill to make it illegal for UK nationals to take girls from Britain to other countries to do it to them. Now, that's us doing our bit. It's deeply ingrained, as you know, in some cultures and traditions, but it's a horrible practice, and it's important that if you hold that view that you say it, and I hope that in time people will come to see it too, and the voices of those who have had it done to them, describing what it was like and what it has meant for the rest of their lives, it seems to me is the most important part of getting attitudes to change, and through politics to do in other countries what we have done here. And the same is true of sending children to school, because there's so many arguments. Education is a human right, it's about your economic future, it's also about developing all of the potential of a nation. And one of my arguments with the Taliban, if I may put it like that, is how can a country like Afghanistan, with all that it has suffered and the extent of the poverty, hope to prosper if half the talent of the next generation is denied by their obscurantism and violence and killing of head teachers and closing of schools the right to have an education? The answer is it's pretty difficult for a country to progress, and therefore we should uphold those who are trying to uphold the right of universal primary education. And I think the third thing to say is about time. Because you just look at our history and what we thought was okay 100 years ago and 500 years ago in this country, and politics and growing awareness and campaigning and not accepting things as they were is how we began to change our society, and it's true for others. Bryony, what a difficult question. I think you partly answered it when you talked about getting people to see just how connected we are, and I suppose it's been a theme of our discussion tonight. Because it is that fundamental choice. You can either say, I'm only going to think about myself and my future and my family, and I'm not going to think about the rest of the world, whether it's your neighbour next door or your neighbour on the other side of the planet, even though you've never actually been introduced to them and you don't know their name, but actually our futures are all bound up together. And I think the way I always argue it is, one, we have a moral responsibility as human beings, do we not?
You don't all have morals, though, do you?
Well, no, not everybody. No, that's true, not everyone has morals. But it is also in our self-interest. And I don't mean by that selfishness. It is sensible. It is in our self-interest that we should do these things and support others who are trying to bring this change about. And the final point I would make is, the more, it's a pretty obvious point, but the more human beings get to know each other, then the less likely it is that some of the horrors that we see in this world are going to happen. And so meeting people, talking to them, linking schools, all of those kind of things, building relationships in the community in one place and community in another, it is fundamental to this, because in the end you come to realise people speak different languages, profess different faiths, look different, wear different clothes, are of some faith or no faith. But when you meet a fellow human being and are able to communicate, you realise that inside we are one, and that's the most, it seems to me, the most important thing that we can learn as human beings, and I wish you and your colleagues every success as you try and do that. And thank you very much for coming this evening.
Thanks, Henry, for thought-provoking and engaging presentation. I think we have learned today a few things from your valuable insight of tackling difficult and thorny issues of international development and the poverty reduction agenda, and the measures you have outlined at the end of your speech to rectify the situation. So thank you very much, and also John Gilly for the response. Please give them a round of applause. We are launching a new campaign, 4D for World Peace. But with the Independence contribution, with John Henry's response, and your question answers and the contributions, I think we have now enough material to sit through for the campaign. So all of you have enriched us with taking forward this campaign. So, and let me thank the committee and the volunteers of our United for Peace who have made this evening a great success. Please give them a round of applause. A word to the audience. I appreciate your tireless efforts in promoting the peace and development agenda. May I request you to take a brief moment to reflect on the evening, especially on the profound words of Mahatma Gandhi, who said, "There are people in the world so hungry that God cannot appear to them except in the form of bread." So, my request is, if you have been inspired by what we are doing, then engage, spread the word, inform others of the good work we are doing, and better still, become our member of Uniting for Peace and support our campaign 4D for World Peace. There are flowers and literature for them to take away and distribute, and also there are buckets for your generous donation. Let me say that today, private citizens like us and yourself have more power to do public good than ever before, because of the rise of the internet campaign and the NGOs as a global movement in the developed and developing world, alike as we are witnessing in Middle East, North Africa, and India, where the famous activist Anna Hazare stood up for corruption against the leaders and business as usual. So, thanks for all of you joining us this evening, activists, thinkers and change makers. You have been a great audience. I know some of you have traveled from far for today. Have a safe journey home. Thank you very much for being here today. We hope to see you again at our next event. And let me say, Happy Universal Peace Day. Thank you.